A little while back, I was flipping through a medieval bestiary, as I am wont to do, and I came across this picture. Aside from being kind of hard to parse, it struck me as really outdated. Obviously, part of that is because it's from a book written in the 13th century, but the dragon itself got me thinking. When was the last time I saw a dragon that looks like this? I mean, dragons in pop culture these days are just very far from this. The Mushus, the Sisus, the Toothlesses. Not exactly the fearsome, bloodthirsty monsters of yore, are they? I guess most of them are still pretty powerful, or at least magical, but in general, they seem a little more like companions, steeds, pets. I mean, Toothless is literally based on a standard black cat, so I'm not even really exaggerating when I say that. I don't know, don't you feel like dragons are just a bit tame now? I understand that this companion dragon thing was subversive once upon a time. You take what was the end-all be-all of horrifying monsters for thousands of years and make it into something that you can control, that you can befriend. And I mean, that is interesting, it's just also pretty played out at this point too. The Dragon Riders of Pern series is fantastic, and the idea of bonding with and riding a dragon was pretty novel back in the 1960s. But now we have the Fourth Wing books that are still coming out and, well, I won't get into that. Suffice to say, it's roughly the same deal. The friendly dragon thing used to be a subversion of expectations. Now it kind of seems to be the new standard, the high fantasy version of a dog. Doesn't that feel like a shame? Like we've lost something? I mean, dragons used to be so much more than this, right? Are they supposed to inspire fear and awe? Don't you miss when dragons were treated as mature, serious fairy tale creatures, a real archetype that you should respect, rather than comedic side characters or plot devices? Maybe it's time to go back to the heyday of dragon lore, when they were made to destroy villages instead of sell toys. Back when dragons were, cool. Back in the day, there was a series of books affectionately known as the Ologies series. I'm sure a fair few of you had a couple of these lying around. One of my human co-writers grew up with the Egyptology one, in fact. One of the standouts in the series, of course, is the Dragonology book, which is exactly what it sounds like. It read like an encyclopedia of the biology and behavior of dragons. This book had diagrams of draconic bodily systems, a codex of draconic language, even samples of dragon scales and spark powder. It was all completely made up, of course. Dragons aren't real. But when you read that book, it felt like they could be. There's something exciting about that. It's kind of fun to do scientific research into a topic that you know is pure fantasy. The idea that something can be studied, categorized, understood just makes it feel more real. If you ask any Game of Thrones buff what the difference between a wyvern and a worm is, they'd tell you that, according to Martin, wyverns don't breathe fire and worms don't have wings. Other dragon enthusiasts might argue that wyverns only have 2 legs, while worms are limbless and drakes are the ones with no wings. There's no consensus because, again, dragons are fictional, but the fact that people argue about this at all means something. There's a desire to engage on a factual level with the fantastic. It's fun. I feel like dragons these days don't really lend themselves to that. Dragons used to be so much more real than they are now. There were countless complex classification systems. Their different colors signified different things about their anatomy. These days, dragons aren't so much a species as they are characters. All of the narrative emphasis is put on the individual dragon's personality and their dynamic with the human protagonists that they accompany. Before dragons had to fit into this subversive companion role, when they were allowed to be dragons, they had so much more range. Think of all the media a few decades ago that treated dragons with gravity. All of the dragons back then were totally different, but in ways that seemed equally plausible. The Spiderwick Chronicles were all about humans learning to interact with dragons and other fantastical creatures that were hiding in the real world. Dungeons & Dragons, obviously, has literally pages and pages of encyclopedic dragon lore spanning decades. The customization of each campaign meant that no 2 experiences would be identical. Even Skyrim, as convoluted as some of its narrative may be, at least tried to do more with its dragons than just, here's a dragon, it's your friend. I mean, it does do that, but it also gives you the option to kill that dragon later on, which I haven't really seen that much of. It was a creative era. It was fun. Each property's version of dragons felt like they had their own earnestly developed identities, rather than just feeling like they had a trope to mold to. When I read the Spiderwick Field Guide, I could suspend my disbelief. Everything was so lovingly crafted and plausibly fleshed out, it felt like those dragons might really be out there somewhere. And as charming as Toothless is, I never really got that sense from him. It seems like the era of dragons as a topic of speculative biology is pretty much over. And the creativity and the imagination and the desire to engage with dragons has kind of vanished alongside it. Now we're left with one-note dragon-shaped sidekicks meant to sell Funko Pops and be voiced by Awkwafina. I just can't help feeling like dragons were cooler when they were actual creatures. Centuries ago, dragons were completely different than what they are now. They were evil monsters that kidnapped princesses and hoarded treasure and burned villages to the ground just for the fun of it. Dragons were, above all else, terrifying. This is probably the version of dragons that springs to mind first for most people. It's the classic depiction that people all over the world have known for generations. I really do mean all over the world. The story of a warrior slaying a dragon to rescue a princess is nearly universal. In many Eastern Slavic cultures, there appears a dragon called Zmei Gornich, a multi-headed beast that kidnaps the niece of Prince Vladimir, only to be slain by the knight Dobrynya Nikitich later on. These sort of stories are so popular in Eastern Europe that they have their own word, bogatyr, to refer to the monster-killing knight. In Japan, a legend tells of the storm god Susanoo tricking the dragon Orochi into getting drunk on sake. With the dragon out of commission, Susanoo chops him up into pieces and throws him in the river, sparing the daughter of a local deity that the dragon had been coming to claim. There's also the Greek myth of the hero Perseus, who encounters the princess Andromeda chained to some rocks as a sacrifice to the sea serpent Cetus. Since he's already on his way home from killing Medusa, Perseus figures he might as well take care of business here too. He kills Cetus, rescues Andromeda, and then uses Medusa's head to paralyze anyone who objects to him marrying her. Romantic, I know. Probably the most well-known version of this story is the medieval Christian tale of St. George and the Dragon. In the story, the dragon terrorizes a nearby pagan village. To keep the dragon placated, the villagers select a daily sacrifice through a lottery. One day, the king's daughter is the unlucky winner. St. George arrives at the scene and incapacitates the dragon, offering to kill it on one condition. All of the pagan villagers convert to Christianity. They all, of course, comply, and the day is saved. There's something so visceral to me about these stories and about the universal fear of dragons. These dragons aren't some concretely developed creatures with well-defined traits that everyone agrees on. They're not treated with the petty veneer of realism. They're more bespoke, tailored to the environment, the mindset of the creatures that created them. The only hard and fast rule for what a dragon should be was, really, evil. You probably know that there are even dragons in the Bible, serving as allegories for Satan. When someone needed a monster thousands of years ago, they usually chose a dragon. When we started creating all these rules about what is and isn't a dragon, it sort of declawed them as a concept, I think. If I have to fill out a Punnett square to figure out what element this dragon is about to breathe on me, I'm not really scared of it. I'm just in a biology class. Once you understand something, it loses that essential fear-inducing uncertainty. It can still be a very powerful, dangerous thing, sure, but at least it's known. That's sort of how I feel about dragons, too. When I look at how outlandish and demonic dragons used to look compared to what we ended up with, they just seem sort of boring in comparison. They're just another predatory animal in the world, no longer a fantasy beast at all. The idea of dragons as just some scientifically reconcilable species is kind of bland, isn't it? Dragons were cooler when they were monsters. Isn't it fascinating that no matter what corner of the earth you look at, nearly every ancient culture had their own version of a dragon? There were European dragons, of course, like the Slavic Zmei Gornich, who I mentioned earlier. The Aztecs worshipped Quetzalcoatl, a deity that could transform into a feathered serpent. In China, dragons were called lung and were benevolent symbols of wisdom and power. The oldest known example might be the Mushushu, an eagle-taloned snake creature from Mesopotamian mythology. Seriously, there are tons of dragons all over ancient mythology if you just keep an eye out for giant reptiles. Which is kind of weird, right? You wouldn't think that so many distinct cultures and so many different environments would dream up essentially the same creature, completely independent of each other. I mean, they all certainly have their differences, but when you look at these, we can recognize each of them right away as being dragons. Because that is what they are. Right? Actually, I'm going to be a bit controversial here and say that none of those creatures are dragons. The African Ninki Nanka isn't a dragon, it's a Ninki Nanka. The Chilean Puchen isn't a dragon, it's a Puchen. You see where I'm going with this? Zmei Goranich, Quetzalcoatl, Lung, none of these things are dragons because they are already something else. The word dragon was applied retroactively. These things didn't come into the world as dragons. They existed for centuries and were suddenly made dragons. The thing about the universality of dragon lore is that it isn't all that far-fetched when you consider what these creatures have in common. A lot of them are chimeric, combinations of different animals to create one bigger, stronger, more fantastical creature. These chimeras usually feature parts from different predators, like the talons of a raptor, the body of a snake, the jaws of a lion. When ancient peoples imagined the scariest possible animal, it would make sense that they'd combine every animal that they'd already knew to be afraid of. It's not that every culture on Earth has dragons, it's that every culture on Earth has at some point been prey. From there, as happened with a variety of made-up creatures, these different beasts took on their own behavior, symbolism, or concepts to be the deity of. Christians, for example, associated snakes with evil and temptation after the whole debacle in the Garden of Eden. This is most likely where the biblical usage of dragons as an allegory for Satan came from. What's the most evil thing Christian monks can think of? A really, really big snake that can fly and spit fire. The word used in most English versions of the Bible, dragon, came from the Latin word Draco, which means big serpent. Not by chance, the same word that was used for the monster that St. George slays in his legend. Remember how that legend ends? The pagan village is so grateful for St. George's help that they immediately ditch their own heathen religion and adopt Christianity. I'm sure you can imagine how popular this legend must have been with missionaries. So, during the Crusades and the centuries after it, Christian missionaries took the legend of St. George and the dragon to every corner of the earth, telling the tale to any foreign culture that would listen, and, many that had no choice but to. Then those missionaries saw the giant reptilian beasts that these other cultures had come up with and said, "Hey, we've got those too. Those are called dragons." And, just like that, they were called dragons. And this is bigger than a word being adopted or applied. All of those distinct individual creatures were suddenly lumped in with the Anglophone idea of a dragon, and they stopped being what they were before. Before all of these creatures became dragons, when they were still individual, distinct creatures, they had nuance. They had their own legends, their own lore, ways of being worshipped and ways of being repelled. As soon as they all got lumped in under the homogeneous dragon umbrella, those things that made them unique were lost. Now the core concept of what dragons even are is so watered down by trying to account for things that shouldn't even be there that being a dragon almost means nothing. Maybe dragons don't need to be these fairy tale monsters. Maybe dragons were cooler before they were dragons. I understand the temptation to dictate what dragons are supposed to be like. The missionaries did it when they made dragons an umbrella term. Dragonology did it when it defined all of these different subspecies of dragon. We are still doing it today when we write yet another friendly dragon sidekick. Like I said, I get it. I do. It's really tempting to sort things into neat categories and draw up rules for them to play by. It makes things seem bigger, almost like you're legitimizing them by corralling them into groups with similar other things. It turns them from an isolated incident to an entire archetype. It's a dangerous thing to do, though. Nuance is inconvenient, yes. It complicates things and highlights the differences that keep things separate. It makes categorization and thereby wide-reaching meaning difficult to establish with certainty. It's also necessary. We lose so much in the Gestalt. There is so much beauty and truth and form in every individual iteration of a concept, no matter how well you feel it snaps into some larger, more convenient framework. Dragons have never really been portrayed in one specific way. There isn't some true ur-dragon that we should try to harken back to. If you follow the dragon timeline backwards, it becomes clear that our understanding of what a dragon is has always been a subversion of what it was before. They might be our pets now, but that's only because they spent so long as formidable beasts. They might have been biological specimens for a time, but only because they were so loved as fairy tale monsters. They might exist in our collective consciousness as an essential story archetype, but before they became a serviceable symbol, they were culture. Unique and varied and impossible to codify so simply. Maybe this fatigue I'm feeling isn't so much to do with dragons as pets or creatures or monsters. Maybe it's to do with dragons as dragons. Maybe, like every well-loved idea given enough time, it's just gotten too categorical for me. Maybe it's time, for the first time in a long time, to let dragons be something else. Remember the ology books I mentioned earlier? Somehow the fact that it was all this technical, biological stuff about fantasy made it more fun than other study for me, more like a game than a lesson. I guess I just tend to enjoy learning more this way, when it's fun and digestible. Which is why, lately, I've really been appreciating our sponsor, Brilliant. I tend to carve out a little free creative time for myself every day. Usually that ends up being reading fiction or writing my own stories, but lately I've found myself gravitating back toward Brilliant's programming stuff, which is weird for me. It's like learning magic, some kind of arcane art, but without the tedium of staring at a tome for hours. I can even use it on my phone, which I'll often do if I'm feeling too lazy to get on the computer. I have never in my life cared about maths and programming, ironically, but Brilliant makes it hard not to. The lessons are all built to encourage me to care. They're all handcrafted by a team of award-winning experts, and they focus on teaching core concepts rather than just memorizing facts. The more time I spend on Brilliant, the more I feel myself, broadening out, opening up. It's not just the programming stuff either. It feels like my general thinking and problem-solving skills have gotten a lot better too. You might even see that reflected in some recent videos if you look hard enough. Learning a little bit like this so easily every day really can be pretty life-changing. Naturally, I was pretty skeptical about it at first, but Brilliant has a free trial, so there's really no reason not to try it. It's how I got started. Just visit brilliant.org/TaleFoundry or use the link in the description below to get your first 30 days for free. And if you end up wanting to sign up, TaleFoundry fans get 20% off. That only works if you use our link, so again, visit brilliant.org/TaleFoundry to get your first 30 days for free and 20% off a year subscription. If you miss the excitement of poring over dragonology books as a kid, or even just the satisfaction of learning something new in general, Brilliant is one of the best ways I know to recapture that feeling. Anyway, that's all for this one. Thanks for watching and keep making stuff up. I'll see you next week. Bye!